Harlem had seen violence before. That wasn't unusual. What made this night different was where it was supposed to happen, who it was meant for, and why it was designed to be public. This wasn't a street ambush or a quiet disappearance. It was meant to be a demonstration, a lesson delivered in front of witnesses, so no one would ever forget it. The target was Bumpy Johnson. Not because he was careless, not because he was exposed, but because the people trying to take Harlem believed fear still worked here. They believed that if they showed enough force, enough confidence, enough brutality in the open, the neighborhood would fall back into line. They misunderstood the room. Public attacks aren't just about eliminating a person. They're about controlling the aftermath, the silence that follows, the hesitation that spreads, the way people start calculating their own safety. That's what the mob wanted, not just Bumpy gone, but Harlem reminded of its place. Instead, the opposite happened. What followed wasn't chaos spiraling out of control. It wasn't panic. It was something far colder. A response so composed, so precise, that it flipped the meaning of the entire moment. The attack failed. But more importantly, the message failed. And when a message collapses in public, it doesn't just disappear, it rebounds. By the end of that night, nothing on the surface looked different. Harlem was still Harlem. The mob was still powerful. No territory changed hands. No declarations were made. But inside the underworld, the calculation shifted. The question was no longer, how do we take Harlem? It became, what does it cost to try again? This story isn't about violence for its own sake. It's about why one public attempt ended an entire strategy. How a single moment, handled the wrong way by the attackers and the right way by their target, turned intimidation into retreat. Because sometimes, the most decisive victories aren't loud, they're unmistakably calm. The decision to target Bumpy Johnson in public wasn't driven by impulse or anger, it was strategic. By the mid-1930 seconds, Harlem had become a problem the mob couldn't solve quietly anymore. Numbers runners refused to flip. Intimidation worked inconsistently. Violence behind closed doors failed to produce the fear it once did. So the calculation changed. When private pressure stops working, power turns theatrical. A public killing isn't about removing one man. It's about collapsing resistance around him. The logic is simple. If the strongest figure can be taken out in front of witnesses, everyone else recalibrates instantly. Silence spreads. Cooperation becomes cheaper than courage. That's why the location mattered more than the target. The mob didn't need Bumpy gone in an alley. They needed him gone where everyone could see it. Harlem, however, wasn't just another territory. It was densely social, tightly observed, and emotionally connected. News didn't travel through newspapers. First, it traveled through people. Any public act there would be retold 100 times before nightfall. The mob understood that. They wanted that amplification. They wanted fear to echo faster than facts. This is where the plan revealed its flaw. Public violence assumes that witnesses will internalize terror and retreat inward. That assumption works in places where people are isolated from one another. Harlem wasn't like that. It was communal. Shared spaces mattered. Reputation mattered. And most importantly, reactions were collective, not individual. A message sent to Harlem didn't land on one person at a time. It landed on the neighborhood as a whole. The mob believed spectacle would override identity. That blood in a public place would force everyone to choose survival over solidarity. What they failed to account for was how Harlem interpreted strength. Here, strength wasn't measured by how loudly you struck. It was measured by how well you controlled the space afterward. By choosing a public killing, the mob raised the stakes beyond life and death. They turned the encounter into a referendum on authority. And once that happens, the outcome stops depending on who throws the first punch. It depends on who controls what comes next. That's the risk of making violence visible. If the message lands wrong, you don't just lose a fight, you lose the room. The person chosen for the job wasn't selected for subtlety. He was chosen to signal intent. When the mob sends someone unfamiliar into a neighborhood like Harlem, it isn't an accident, it's a statement. Outsiders are meant to project inevitability. They arrive without history, without relationships, without hesitation. The message is simple. This decision was made elsewhere, and it's already in motion. From the mob's perspective, that kind of emissary solved two problems at once. First, it insulated local operators. If things went wrong, distance could be maintained. Second, it reinforced hierarchy. This wasn't a personal dispute with Bumpy Johnson. It was enforcement of policy. Harlem was being reminded that decisions affecting it could be approved far beyond its borders. But this is where the plan began to fracture. Harlem isn't hostile to outsiders by default. It's observant. It measures intent before it reacts. An unfamiliar presence doesn't blend in, it stands out. Movement gets noticed, patterns get logged. In a place where everyone knows everyone, anonymity lasts minutes, not days. The very thing the mob relied on, the outsider's lack of ties, became a liability. The man sent to Harlem understood force. What he didn't understand was context. He treated the neighborhood like a stage where intimidation alone could carry the scene. That works in places where fear travels faster than information. In Harlem, information traveled first. This wasn't a duel between two individuals. It was a collision between two systems. One believed authority came from reputation built elsewhere. The other believed authority came from alignment with the space you were standing in. The mob's envoy brought confidence. Harlem brought awareness. And awareness shifts power quickly. By the time the encounter approached its breaking point, the outcome was already constrained. Not by courage or luck, but by visibility. In a public setting, every move would be interpreted. Every pause would be weighed. This wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who understood the environment well enough to act without losing control of it. The mob had sent a symbol of force. What they encountered instead was a place that didn't read symbols the way they expected. In Harlem, nothing arrives unnoticed. Long before a move is made, the neighborhood registers intent. Faces get remembered, routes get tracked. A stranger doesn't need to announce himself for attention to follow. He only needs to be out of place. That's the first misunderstanding. The mob's plan ran into the belief that a public space is anonymous. It isn't. The man sent into Harlem moved with purpose, and purpose is loud in a place that listens. He didn't know the rhythm of the streets, the timing of the crowds, or which corners watched more closely than they looked. He assumed observation required organization. In Harlem, it didn't. Awareness was informal, automatic, and fast. News didn't spread as a warning. It spread as confirmation. By the time the encounter drew near, Bumpy Johnson wasn't guessing. He wasn't reacting. He was operating with information already tested by the space around him. That difference matters. Reaction creates chaos. Preparedness creates options. Public places amplify mistakes. Every decision becomes performative whether you want it to or not. Harlem understood that. The room understood that. The person sent to make an example of someone else underestimated how quickly a public setting removes the luxury of surprise. Once eyes lock in, momentum narrows. The window for intimidation closes. This is where Harlem's real power surfaced not as resistance, but as alignment. The space itself constrained what could happen next. A crowded room isn't neutral. It forces calculations no one can ignore. Movements have consequences. Hesitation has meaning. And escalation carries collateral weight that can't be walked back. The mob's plan depended on fear spreading outward from a single moment. Harlem's reality inverted that logic. Information arrived first. Context followed. Fear had nowhere to root because understanding arrived before panic. When a neighborhood reads a situation clearly, it stops being a backdrop and starts becoming a participant, not by intervening, but by being present. The room didn't need to act. Its awareness shaped the boundaries of the encounter. By the time the moment of decision arrived, the stage was already set not by the attacker, but by the place itself. And in Harlem, the place always has a say. The critical moment wasn't the attack itself. It was the decision made just before it could unfold. In a public space, choice arrives early and leaves little room for error. Every option carries consequences that extend beyond the people involved. And that's where Bumpy Johnson recognized the real problem. Allowing the attacker to move first would have surrendered control of the room. In a crowded setting, that meant uncertainty not just for him, but for everyone around him. Public intimidation only works if panic spreads faster than understanding. Here, panic would have multiplied risk. Innocent people, tight quarters, and unpredictable reactions would turn a single act into uncontrollable chaos. Once that door opens, no one decides what happens next. So the choice wasn't between confrontation and avoidance. It was between who defines the terms. Acting too late hands initiative to the attacker. Acting too loudly hands the narrative to fear. The only viable path was to end the threat before it could dictate the rhythm of the room, and to do it decisively enough that escalation had nowhere to go. This is where power becomes visible without being theatrical. Control doesn't announce itself. It compresses time. The response was immediate, contained, and final in its intent. Stop the sequence before it could branch, not to prove dominance, but to prevent collateral consequence. The room needed to return to order faster than rumor could form. Public spaces reward clarity. When a situation resolves quickly and cleanly, people don't spiral into speculation. They register a boundary and move on. That boundary is what matters. The choice communicated wasn't rage or bravado. It was responsibility. The understanding that letting a spectacle grow would be more dangerous than stopping it outright. Afterward, the most important thing happened. Normalcy resumed. Not instantly, but deliberately. Chairs righted, voices lowered. The signal was unmistakable. The event was over. No chase, no display, no invitation for a second act. In a room full of witnesses, ending a crisis cleanly is more powerful than winning it loudly. This is the mistake outsiders often make. They think public force magnifies authority. In reality, it magnifies consequences. The person who maintains order under pressure, who closes the moment instead of feeding it, claims the room. And once the room is claimed, the message travels on its own. What followed wasn't remembered for movement. It was remembered for stillness. In a space that had been seconds away from panic, the most unsettling thing was how quickly everything slowed down. No shouting orders, no chase, no lingering chaos. The room didn't erupt, it locked. That reaction mattered more than the confrontation itself. Bumpy Johnson didn't assert control by escalating. He asserted it by ending the moment. Once the immediate danger was neutralized, there was no performance, no follow-through meant to amplify fear. Instead, there was a deliberate return to normal behavior, a signal that the crisis had a clear boundary, and that boundary had already been reached. This is where intimidation failed and authority took over. People expect violence to expand. They expect aftermath, shouting, scrambling, retaliation. When none of that happens, the brain struggles to recalibrate. Witnesses don't know how to respond because the usual cues are missing. The room goes quiet, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Something has occurred that doesn't fit the expected script. That's what froze the room. By refusing to dramatize what had just happened, Bumpy stripped it of contagious energy. The event didn't get a second life. It didn't invite imitation or escalation. It was contained, framed, and closed in real time. In public spaces, that's the highest form of control, not dominating attention, but denying it momentum. The message embedded in that response was unmistakable. This wasn't chaos breaking out. This was chaos being shut down. And the difference matters to people who calculate risk for a living. If violence can be stopped and normalized immediately afterward, It stops being a useful tool. The witnesses didn't leave talking about fear alone. They left talking about composure, about precision, about how quickly the room was reclaimed. That kind of story travels differently. It doesn't inspire panic. It inspires caution. By the end of the night, the confrontation itself was already secondary. What mattered was the demonstration that public disorder could be neutralized without turning into spectacle. For anyone watching, especially those who sent the attacker, that realization carried a cost. Because once a room has been frozen like that, you don't rush to test it again. What ended that night in Harlem wasn't just an attack. It was a strategy, a belief that public fear could still bend a neighborhood into submission. And when that belief collapsed, it didn't collapse loudly, it collapsed permanently. The attempt failed on the surface, but its deeper failure was psychological. The mob didn't lose a man. It lost certainty. Certainty that intimidation still worked here. Certainty that violence, when displayed openly, would automatically produce control. After that night, every future calculation had to include a new variable. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just hard to eliminate, he was dangerous to confront publicly. That distinction matters in organized power. Private conflicts can be retried. Public failures become warnings. Once a message backfires in front of witnesses, repeating it only multiplies the damage. Harlem didn't need another demonstration. The first one was enough. What spread through the underworld wasn't the story of an attack. It was the story of restraint, of how quickly chaos was shut down, of how the room was reclaimed, of how a public space, meant to be turned into a stage for fear, became proof that fear no longer dictated outcomes there. That's why the mob backed off. Not because of respect in the sentimental sense, and not because of sympathy. They backed off because the cost of trying again had become unpredictable. And unpredictability is poison to any system built on control. Legends aren't made by how much damage is done. They're made by moments that close doors. That night closed one. After it, Harlem was no longer a place you tested with spectacle. It was a place you negotiated carefully, quietly, and from a distance. The attack was meant to end a man. Instead, it ended a strategy.